Before I jump into the video, make sure to check out an NFL and NBA podcast I have with a couple buds. It's called the Backseat GM, and you can find it on your favorite streaming platform. Also, if you enjoy this content, make sure to subscribe if you haven't yet and leave a comment on a player that you would like me to look at next. As always, thank you, and let's move on to the video. Will Anderson is a great defensive player for Alabama. As the captain for their defense, he had 17.5 sacks in 2021. He was 5th in Heisman voting that same year as a defensive player. And Will Anderson did all that against the SEC. How could I even consider someone else in the draft being a better prospect? Well, let me first explain what he's great at, why he reminds me of Emmanuel Ogbah for the Miami Dolphins, and why I have some caution with the idea of him being the first player drafted. To get started, I think it's important to note how Nick Saban has had high praise for Will Anderson. He has called Will a great leader, a great talent, and Nick Saban has praised both his football IQ and his love for the game. That alone should at least put Will Anderson on your radar. But as the overall number one player on most draft boards, you've probably gotten to know Will Anderson pretty well by now. Will Anderson is a player who wins with both his natural ability and with his hands. Talking about his natural ability, he shows solid strength and even better athleticism. While his jump at the snap of the ball isn't always perfect, we do see some really solid get-offs that allow him to get his hands on the offensive lineman quickly. But even if he doesn't have a great jump, we see the natural speed when he's rushing the passer. I have also read other scouting reports knocking Will Anderson for both his flexibility and his bend. And while he can play stiff at times, I actually don't think his raw flexibility is as bad as people say. I've seen him use his flexibility and leverage to his advantage when either stopping the run or getting after the quarterback. And while his power isn't great, I've seen him once again combine leverage with power to bull rush the offensive tackle back into his quarterback. One thing that Will Anderson does best is use his hands to break free from the offensive line with his block shedding abilities. He also shows a good spin move to disengage if he has trouble winning the one-on-one. While he has had a handful of sacks come from shedding the block, you really see it come in handy when he stops the quarterback from scrambling or stops the run with ease. His block shed alone easily makes him one of the best run-stopping edge rushers in the entire class. But at the same time, when you watch his film, many of Will Anderson's sacks came uncontested, often as a benefit from Nick Saban's defensive scheme. It's very similar to how Emmanuel Ogbah is used for the Dolphins. Both Emmanuel Ogbah and Will Anderson were able to get extra sacks by being used in a scheme where they could essentially confuse the offensive line, and they would start on the outside on the edge and end up inside where the interior defensive tackles are, often being unblocked or barely even touched at this time. They do, however, both show a good rim move to get to the quarterback, although, of course, at this point, Emmanuel Ogbah, with 7 years in the NFL, does do it more consistently. But to summarize, we do see their use as defenders to be very similar. And while we do see the great occasional rip move or even swim move come from Will Anderson, it's not quite consistent enough for me to feel confident drafting him number 1 overall. On most pass rushing downs, he looks to get his hands on the offensive lineman, instead of trying to go around them or immediately use a pass rush move to get to the quarterback. He's very talented, but he's still pretty raw in this aspect. As someone who would still draft Will Anderson in the top 15, I do see a path where he reaches greatness. He shows the potential, and he shows the work ethic and leadership to get there. However, he does show some inconsistencies and was given a boost to his stats based on Bama's defensive scheme. He's a great player, there's no denying it. But I do think NFL teams should at least be a little more cautious before immediately putting him at number 1 on their big boards.